Hi folks, it's James here and welcome to another video. This is going to be a David Bowie collection special. So let's get straight down to business. This is Bowie's second album, I believe. And this was a reissue that came out a couple of years ago now, which I picked up. I picked this one up because it was, well, I don't have Bowie's first album, but this was the only, but apart from that, this was the only one I didn't have. Of the initial run of albums from his first album through to Let's Dance, so I thought I would grab that. I think this one came out, was it on gold, this one? Or was it just on black? No, this was just on black. And I picked up most of my David Bowie albums back in the 1990s from charity shops, really. In fact, I think I got most of them from the Oxfam shop in Headingley in Leeds. And back then, you know, obviously, you know, Bowie was alive still, and he didn't, I think, you know, I mean, he's always had this amazing reputation, but I think back then his records were not particularly precious commodities. I picked up most of them for about £2.50, you know, and it was a great exploration for me in my 20s because, strangely enough, Bowie was not one of the people who I'd been into as a kid. I got into music very early, from the age of about maybe 7 or 8, and I was into Pink Floyd, and I was into Queen, and I was into Wings, but Bowie completely passed me by, really. I only really became aware of his music when I went to university in 1989. A friend of mine was a huge fan of Bowie, and he loved the Scary Monsters album, and I heard that for the first time, and I started to clue into Bowie. So I left uni in '92, and by the mid-90s in Leeds I was starting to become curious. I was finding his albums in the wild up and down the place, like I said, mainly in Oxfam. They were dead cheap. This one here you can see, The Man Who Sold the World, £2.99, and that was kind of how it was, really. It's very difficult to identify a lot of my Bowie albums. I've tried looking on Discogs, and it's just a nightmare trying to find your edition. For some reason, you know, there were so many different versions of Bowie albums, it's just really difficult to track them down, so I haven't actually bothered for this video trying to work out which presses I've got. By the time he came to do this album, he'd started to pioneer this great kind of early 1970s hard rock sound, that great Trident sound. You know, this album was recorded at Trident Studios, which had a legendary drum sound. If you think of the drum sound on Queen 2, or I mean the first two Queen albums were recorded at Trident, this album was as well. And this has got the great band, you know, Mick Ronson enters the picture, you've got Woody Woodmansey on drums, you know, fantastic musician, Tony Visconti on electric bass, and some great tracks, obviously, you know, black country rock, The Width of a Circle, Bowie's propensity for esoteric and slightly mystical lyrics. You know, he was really into the occult and black magic and arcane literature, and that was starting to come through with his lyrics. And you got The Man Who Sold the World, which Kurt Cobain covered, obviously, which is one of the great hard rock songs of the 1970s. Great sound on that record. It's one I'm really, really fond of. I'm not sure if I'm going to show you all the labels on these because it will just take too long. I mean, you know, he was on RCA. Most of these records are on green or black RCA. So that's The Man Who Sold the World, £2.99. Then you've got another magnum opus, of course, Hunky Dory. And it's quite amazing to think that at this point Bowie was still not famous. He was still a scuffling singer-songwriter. You know, this album is kind of viewed now in retrospect as this great rock classic, and you think of it as being one of his huge albums, but he was still reasonably obscure at this point. And this saw him, I think this kind of started to show people what a strong singer-songwriter he was. You've got a lot more acoustic songs on here, you know, piano-based songs. Rick Wakeman, of course, appears on this record. And as soon as you hear songs like Changes and, you know, Life on Mars, you start to realise that you're dealing with a seriously major talent. And you've got Kooks on here as well, which is one of my favourites, which shows his more, his kind of quirky English side. He was really influenced by Syd Barrett and that kind of art school, you know, Pete Townsend kind of English lyricism, Ray Davis. And yeah, I mean, this is a great album. It's tails off a little bit for me on side 2. I love side 1 of Hunky Dory. Side 2 perhaps a bit less so, but I mean still, you know, an absolutely legendary album, and you know, once again that's on Trident with the great Trident sound. Yeah, Life on Mars, truly epic in scale. But of course he was en route to something much bigger and much more ambitious, and that was Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. This is the reissue that came out a few years ago, and this one is on a rather dirty shade of gold. And yeah, don't need to say too much about this record. It's one of the all-time great rock classics. It's got a very celebratory sound. A friend of mine the other day was playing a copy of it that he just got hold of, and he's a Bowie fan from back in the day, and he was just saying he loves the kind of the fervency of it. It's got a real kind of vibey, celebratory, soulful kind of sound, really, and wonderful arrangements from Mick Ronson. You've got Trevor Bolder on bass. You know, the band is really starting to kick. Starman, 5 Years, Suffragette City, just iconic rock songs from the beginning of the 1970s, ushered in the glam era, and it was arguably the crowning achievement of that era, or it's maybe the most representative album from that period, and I think it started to represent Bowie as a true cultural force, and I think what he really represented for a lot of people was a kind of escapist refuge, you know, away from the world. I think, much like the Beatles had done in the 60s, he showed the way to become an individual. You know, he really, oddly enough, because he went from one guise to another, he was going through these different disguises or guises. You know, he went from Ziggy through to Aladdin Sane, through to the Thin White Duke, so he had all these different masks that he was wearing. But the accumulative effect of that over the years, I think he showed people how to be individual. You know, he kind of allowed people to celebrate their own individuality and to find some kind of escape, I suppose, from just the labels that the world puts around your neck. And I think that's the contribution he made. Obviously, he was hugely popular among kind of subcultures and minorities. You know, I mean, you know, he had a big following in the gay community and the bisexual community. So anyway, Ziggy is where that big kind of culturally important story starts, I think, for Bowie, and it's a great album. And then he kind of totally went off again, not in a completely different direction. He still stayed with the kind of, you know, the glam trappings, but he fashioned a new identity. This is Aladdin Sane. I picked this up a couple of years ago at a charity clearance warehouse. This actually is an early pressing. It's one of the only Bowie records in my collection which is an early pressing. I think it's a Canadian first press, actually. And this record is another masterful work. It contains one of my favourite Bowie tracks, which is the track Aladdin Sane itself, which features that wonderful splintered piano solo from Mike Garson, where he just basically kind of crashes up and down the keyboard, and it's just amazing fragmentary piano solo, which really sets the tone. But you've also got some big show-stopping numbers. Time on this album, I think, sounds like a great big musical number almost, or a show tune. Actually, a show tune more than musical. It's a very theatrical record. Drive-In Saturday with all the saxophone. Panic in Detroit, which has a kind of scratchy, nervous energy to it. And you've got his version of Let's Spend the Night Together, which is a really pumping, high-octane version of that song. And the Gene Genie is the big hit off this record. So another great kind of vibey sound. You know, the band is there again. Mick Ronson, Trevor Bolder, Woody Woodmansey. Yeah, just legendary stuff. Then you have this album, which was a recent gift from John Bellamy, and this was the only one of the original albums that I didn't have, and I mentioned that in a video, so John was kind enough to send it to me. This is his covers album, which I'm still exploring. Contains his version of See Emily Play, which further illustrates what a big influence the early Pink Floyd was on Bowie. And I think that was an important album. I think that was, you know, the 1970s, people were turning their backs on the 60s a lot, I think. If you think, you know, as it got into the punk years particularly, and even in the glam years, you know, when T-Rex became big, when Roxy Music became big, when Bowie became big, there was a sort of feeling that, you know, this is our music now, and we've moved into the 1970s, and we're going to forget about all that 60s rubbish. And I think that was a really important album because Bowie was trying to remind people of where he'd come from. And at this point, the 60s were a really recent happening. It wasn't distant history or anything. So I think it was an important record for Bowie to make, to show that he was still involved in this ever-evolving continuum of rock music, and paying tribute to some of the bands and artists that had made him what he was. Then you've got a real monster of a record. Now this is an 80s reissue that does not have a gatefold, unfortunately. I'm still looking for a gatefold, but Diamond Dogs is one of my favourite Bowie albums, and strangely enough it's the one where he plays most of the guitar. I learned about that years ago, and he decided he was going to play electric guitar on the record. He wanted things to be a bit more primitive. He didn't want the kind of just the really advanced musical textures that Mick Ronson could offer, so he just played the guitar himself. And he plays a kind of really raunchy style of guitar. It's deeply rooted in rock and roll, and you can hear the Stooges coming through, and you can hear a bit of Chuck Berry, and just that kind of early rock sound. And but the production on this record, it's just one of those great vibey David Bowie albums. There are touches of Philly soul or 70s soul music, blaxploitation kind of sound. I'm thinking of the song 1984, which has all the strings on it and the bongos, you know. It's just fantastic. It's one of Bowie's more kind of nightmarish albums. You know, you've got the reference to George Orwell and in 1984, and you've got all that kind of strange, disturbing atmospheres at the beginning, and the kind of the spoken word bit at the start, which is quite apocalyptic. I think Bowie was maybe starting to reflect that kind of very, very bleak mid-1970s thing that was happening in England, you know, as we kind of entered recession. And what year was this? This was probably kind of mid-1970s, and I think we had the Labour government by then, and you know, things were not going well with British industry, and there was a kind of dystopian atmosphere starting to seep through into British culture compared to the 1960s, which had been very rosy and very optimistic. And this is one of the albums I think which charted that really well. Rebel Rebel is the big hit off this album, and it's got a great closing song, Chant of the Ever-Circling Skeletal Family, which goes into this kind of manic loop at the end, and it's a really unique record, I think. That I can't think of another album ever which sounded like Diamond Dogs. Having said that, you could say that about most Bowie albums, really. Then we move on to possibly one of the albums that has connected with me least over the years, and I need to go back to it. This is Young Americans, where he teamed up with Carlos Alomar for the first time, the guitarist. You've got collaborations with John Lennon on this record. You've got his cover of Across the Universe, and he's moved into into a kind of funk R&B kind of sound. I think it coincided with the years he spent some time in LA. I think at the same time as George Harrison. I think George Harrison and David Bowie were both quite heavily involved in the LA drug scene, you know, in the cocaine scene, and this was Bowie attempting, I think, to become a kind of real mainstream R&B, contemporary, soul, funk kind of artist. You can see how his image on the cover there was going to prove very influential later on in the 1980s as we moved into the New Romantic era. Then things get possibly more interesting again with Station to Station, which was the album he made. I think he made this just after he'd done the film The Man Who Fell to Earth. The cover has a still from that film on the cover. This, I think this was called Bowie's most impenetrable album at the time. I think Rolling Stone called it that. And it is a kind of towering epic in his catalogue. It's very mysterious. Right back to the opening track, it starts out with that chugging train sound, and you get a picture of a train emerging from the mist, you know, kind of dark fog of Nazi Germany, quite possibly. He was really starting to explore European themes now, his music. You know, he'd done the Young Americans thing, the American thing was finished, and he was starting to turn his attention to Europe and European history. The move to Berlin was just around the corner, and you know, there were kind of torch songs on this record, and it's a very it's a very dark and enigmatic record. It's got the two towering ballads on it, Wild is the Wind, which is one of his most breathtaking vocal performances, and Word on a Wing as well. TVC15 at the start of side 2 is hugely atmospheric, and I like the way this record, it's clearly a kind of, it's a sort of transitional album, I think, and it points the way towards the more cutting edge approach. So we kind of enter the Berlin trilogy. We have Low, recorded with Tony Visconti and with help from Brian Eno, which doesn't need much introduction. This is another repress, an 80s repress that I picked up back in the day. So, you know, the concept, you've got one side full of songs, one side full of strange instrumental cuts. You've got Warzawa, and which is very bleak, and it conjures up images of a kind of post-war Europe, really, as does Subterraneans. Always reminds me of, it evokes images of somebody walking through a blasted out city, and you know, everybody's dead and there's snow falling, and it's just a very emotionally bleak record. Side 1 is really good. It's quite fragmented sounding. You've got, I mean, the big song is Breaking Glass, and but I also love the closing track on side 1, A New Career in a New Town, which has that wonderful melancholy, is it a harmonica? Yeah, I mean, just a really unusual record in his catalogue, and one that was absolutely panned at the time. I mean, you know, I think nobody really knew what to make of it, because it came out during the punk years, when everybody was meant to be making these very confrontational, angry records. And I think it seemed at the time as if Bowie was starting a protracted bout of navel gazing, really. I mean, he came back with Heroes, which was kind of part 2, really. It was another thing where you had songs on side 1, and then these very introverted instrumentals on side 2. I actually prefer the song side of Low, but I prefer the instrumental side of this album. I think it's just got some absolutely brilliant stuff on it. It's even more abstract, I think, than the instrumental stuff which is on Low. You've got Moss Garden, which is just, it kind of floats off almost, and you get this sense that you've entered a completely private world. It's almost like you're kind of, you know, in a strange environment under the ocean or something. You know, he's just totally disappeared into inner space. But what I love about this record, unlike Low, is that it ends on this fantastic kind of high note. Unlike Low, I mean, Low does end really well with Subterraneans. That is a great ending in a way, but it's really downbeat and bleak. Whereas this record ends with The Secret Life of Arabia, which is one of my favourite Bowie songs of all time. It's got that great kind of fervent, hand-clappy kind of sound, very epic sounding, and with that kind of long drawn-out fade at the end. It's just fantastic. And this record obviously contains his monster hit, Heroes, which is possibly the most definitive David Bowie song, I suppose. And Robert Fripp on guitar, and just the band again, Carlos Alomar, Dennis Davis on drums, George Murray on bass, and I think they really invented a way of playing with Bowie. You know, they kind of stepped up to the plate, I think, in these records. They don't sound like anything else, but they went on to become massively influential in the 80s. That was on Green RCA. The third record in the Bowie, in the Berlin trilogy, is Lodger, and again, I haven't connected as much with this one. It's a record which, every time I go back to it, I really enjoy it, but for some reason it doesn't pull me in like those first two have done. So I need to spend more time with it. This is another repress, which is a bit disappointing. It's not a gatefold version, so I need to find a gatefold version of that. And I need to spend more time with this record. I feel like I've neglected it over the years, and I think my initial impression of it was rather anticlimactic. You know, as the supposed climax to that Berlin trilogy, perhaps I didn't think that it quite cut the mustard, but I have revisited it in recent years, and I've been surprised at how great it is, you know. So I really need to spend some quality time with it, and maybe listen to all 3 of those albums in one go, and just try and get my head round the 3 records as a piece, really, with Lodger being the final chapter in the story. Okay, nearly there. So then we move on to a really influential album, Scary Monsters. This was another cheap copy from back in the day. This album has Robert Fripp on it again. It contains a version of Kingdom Come by Tom Verlaine. It has the monster hit Scary Monsters and Ashes to Ashes, and it has Fashion, the two versions of It's No Game, Teenage Wildlife. It has a very the sound on this record. It reminds me of the stuff that Steve Albini was going to go on to do with Big Black, and you can hear pre-echoes of things like the Jesus and Mary chain. It's a kind of, I don't know, it's a very sort of thin, trebly sound. I think at the time, Bowie was really looking around him, seeing what was happening in music, seeing things going in a more, well, it's that kind of new wave, edgy kind of sound. He wanted to be part of that, but rather than following the pack, he kind of found his own twist on it. And, you know, from the cover onwards, you can see how influential his image was going to be in the 80s, and the sound of this record just went on to influence countless imitators. It trails off a little bit, I think, on side 2. I think side 1 it is really, really strong. Side 2 possibly less so. But I think there's a strong argument to say that this was this was the final, this was the last time that Bowie was truly in the area that you might describe as cutting edge. And after this, he went off in a totally different direction. He did find his feet again many years later, but I think the 80s were a tricky time for him, but that was certainly a good way to start. And then, just to bring things up to date as far as this video is concerned, you've got Let's Dance, which was probably Young Americans Part 2. It was him trying to reconnect back again to the American R&B thing. Stevie Ray Vaughan plays guitar on this record, and you've got Nile Rodgers producing Chic, one of the monster hit makers of the 80s. I think it was quite canny of Bowie to go with Nile. I think Nile Rodgers was a bit disappointed in later years that Bowie never worked with him again, or didn't seem to want to work with him again. I think Nile Rodgers was really proud of this album, and I think he saw it as... I think I saw an interview with him somewhere where he said, as far as I'm concerned, Let's Dance is as important a record, culturally, as A Kind of Blue. Now, I'm not sure if that's just him blowing his own trumpet, but I think what he was saying was that he really thought that he and David were an amazing combination in the studio, and I think he was reasonably puzzled as to why Bowie never went back and asked him to work with him again. I think Nile Rodgers saw it maybe potentially as the beginning of this great kind of glorious partnership, which was going to go through the 1980s, and David Bowie, and Bowie being Bowie, he wanted to go off again and do something else, so that kind of never happened. But it's tantalising to imagine how Bowie's 80s would have shaped up had he not done Tin Machine, and had he not done this, that and the other, but you know, had he stayed with Nile and done some more albums like this. It's not one of my favourite Bowie albums, to be fair, but you can't argue with the track listing. You know, you've got the title track, Let's Dance, you've got China Girl as well, obviously, two big kind of 80s hits. But it was the start of Bowie crossing into the mainstream, I think, having been this very subversive, alternative kind of figure, and he was now on a different path, I think. But still, there was a quote from, I think it was Rolling Stone magazine, who said something like, this was the greatest 14 album run in rock history, these records I've just shown. So yeah, you can make up your own mind about that, but I mean, certainly it's a very singular body of work. I'm pleased to have it all on vinyl. I do have some albums by Bowie from later in his career on CD, and I'll do a separate video about those in due course. But I thought I'd share the collection with you and ramble on a bit about classic vintage Bowie. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon. Leave some comments below. Take care. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.